Tonight, President Trump makes his case to the nation. His party has sought to reassure voters of his character while the country faces a number of crises. That dynamic was on full display last night at the Republican National Convention. Vice President Mike Pence officially accepted renomination for the GOP ticket this November. He criticized Democrats for racial unrest in cities like Kenosha, Minneapolis, and Portland without mentioning the police shootings which triggered them.
The hard truth is, you won't be safe in Joe Biden's America. And under President Trump, we will always stand with those who stand on the thin blue line, and we're not going to defund the police, not now, not ever.
In fact, Joe Biden has said on a number of occasions he does not support defunding the police. The Republican convention speakers have largely avoided the topic of racial injustice and the names of Black Americans who have died at the hands of police. Names like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Jacob Blake Jr. Pence called for law and order as protests against police brutality and racism now threaten to end professional sports seasons. All 3 NBA playoff games were postponed yesterday, led by the Milwaukee Bucks. Point guard George Hill spoke on the team's behalf to present their demand for justice.
We are calling for justice for Jacob Blake and demand the officers be held accountable. For this to occur, it is imperative for the Wisconsin State Legislature to reconvene after months of inaction and take up meaningful measures to address issues of police accountability, brutality, and criminal justice reform.
The WNBA and several Major League Baseball teams also joined the protest. Tonight, the president will once again use the White House for his political staging, something which raises ethical concerns. His speech coincides with Hurricane Laura bearing down on the Gulf Coast. The Category 4 storm struck Louisiana and Texas late last night. 150-mile-per-hour winds tore roofs, shattered windows, and left trees on top of homes. Officials report at least 3 people have died from the storm. Rescue crews across the region are searching for survivors among the debris. The coronavirus pandemic also looms over the president's speech tonight. More than 180,000 people in the U.S. have died from the virus, with a daily rate of about 1,000 in the past week. Americans report more than 5.8 million cases. The vice president did express sympathy for those impacted by COVID-19. He did so while touting the administration's response and again attacking Joe Biden.
Now, last week, Joe Biden said that no miracle is coming. Well, what Joe doesn't seem to understand is that America is a nation of miracles.
Let's bring in our panel, Nicole Killion, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Meredith McGraw. Nicole is a CBS News correspondent, Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter, and Meredith is a White House reporter for Politico. Welcome to all of you. Nicole, let me start with you. The convention has focused a lot on what the Trump administration says it has accomplished. Have we heard plans for what they will do if given another 4 years?
Well, you know, it's interesting because Republicans have been very critical of the Democrats during their convention, that they were short on policy specifics. And yet with the Republicans, you know, we haven't necessarily heard a lot of specifics on their end either, a lot of vague platitudes. We did hear a sense of what a second term for Donald Trump might look like. For instance, the vice president yesterday talked about an agenda of freedom, backing law enforcement, touting school choice, which has been a common thread and theme that we've heard throughout this convention. We also heard from the president's economic advisor earlier this week touting more tax cuts, more regulatory rollbacks. The president's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, talking about the president will continue to stand by Americans with pre-existing conditions. And even when the president has at times been pressed about a second agenda, he hasn't always been clear. And quite frankly, I think there's a lot of interest tonight, too, in what the president is going to say about the here and now. You mentioned the hurricane. We do know the president will mention in the hurricane tonight. In fact, he considered postponing his speech, he told reporters a short time ago, but decided to move forward with it. Also, as you mentioned, the situation that's been unfolding all this week in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We did hear the vice president touch on it last night. We do know the president will make a reference to what's happening there. What we don't know is, will he specifically say the name of Jacob Blake, the unarmed African-American man who was shot 7 times in the back? So those are all questions certainly that we have as we look ahead to the speech. We do know, as far as specifically when it comes to a second term, aides and advisors to the president have said that he will describe an uplifting, optimistic view of the United States. We also know that his message will be one where he directly contrasts and provides 2 distinct visions between what his administration will look like for the next 4 years compared to that of Joe Biden's.
Well, Caitlin, Democratic vice presidential candidate and California Senator Kamala Harris spoke at length this afternoon about the Kenosha protests. Let's play her remarks.
As Vice President Biden put it, the shots fired at Mr. Blake pierced the soul of our nation. It's sickening to watch. It's all too familiar, and it must end.
Caitlin, give us a sense. How have the Trump and Biden camps talked about these protests?
Well, in very different ways. The Trump campaign and Republicans have been focusing on violence that has erupted in several cities. You heard the messaging coming out of the Republican National Convention all week, and that's really, I think, in an attempt to reach Republican voters and even some of those disaffected Republican voters or former Republicans who are trying to figure out who to support this time around, kind of focus on the security aspect, this law and order aspect. We'll see if that works, but I thought it was really interesting to see Kamala Harris today. She's a former prosecutor. This is going to be a role we're going to consistently see her in this campaign, going on the attack against Trump and the Republicans and Mike Pence. And she really wove all of these things together. We saw Joe Biden give a video yesterday where he said that, of course, he supports the protests, but he does not condone the violence, and he condemned it. You heard that also from Kamala Harris today, mentioning how the tickets spoke with the family and kind of noted that the family, too, argued for no violence. She said also, I thought, she said she condemned the looting and the violence, including that from the shooter who was arrested for murder. So tying all of that together, and I think that's something that we'll continue to see from that side as well.
Well, Caitlin, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi suggested Joe Biden should skip the debates with President Trump. Why did she make those remarks, and is the Biden campaign actually considering that?
Well, Joe Biden said today that in an interview afterwards that he is planning to do all 3 debates, that he wants to, quote, fact check Trump on the floor. But it is very bizarre and peculiar that Nancy Pelosi suggested skipping all of the debates altogether. And you could tell with the Biden camp's response, quick response, that they didn't want to go that route. The Biden campaign has not been doing a lot of press conferences. Yes, they've been doing some interviews. They've been doing press conferences really every few weeks. The ticket has not appeared in front of a press conference since they have been nominated for the position, even though they did an interview together with ABC over the weekend. So the idea of skipping debates would be very problematic and would do a disservice to voters. The Biden campaign says that they don't want to go that route.
Yeah, we look forward to whenever the ticket does decide to have their first news conference together. That's something obviously you and many others would be very interested in. Meredith, let me turn to you. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, who spoke Monday, was on CBS This Morning today, and I want to play what he said he'd like to hear from President Trump.
Well, I hope he starts with Kenosha and the hurricane. These are two major incidents or issues that are overwhelming good people throughout this country, and our focus and our attention is there. And then I think he has to touch on the pandemic as well. But I hope that he also looks to our future and talks about bringing this nation together and making sure that we return to the pre-COVID-19.
Meredith, what do you think the chances are that the president speaks to those things?
Well, it is expected that the president will address Kenosha in some form. The president is expected to talk about, of course, his theme of law and order and address things like crime. But again, the question is whether or not he will specifically address some of the victims of police brutality that have really set off this wave of protests across the country. And the president, as his advisors have said, is expected to paint a more optimistic picture of the country, but he is going to be going after Joe Biden hard on things like trade, China, taxes. But tonight, I'm also going to be looking to hear from some of the other speakers that will be there, people like Ann Dorn, the widow of David Dorn, an off-duty cop who was killed in St. Louis, or Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. I think some of the speakers that they've chosen also speak to some of the second-term agenda priorities that the president hasn't been very good about articulating, but you can tease out from the speakers that they've chosen to put up there on stage.
Nicole, on the pandemic, we're now hearing reports that the Centers for Disease Control is backtracking on new guidance and admitting being pressured by the administration. What can you tell us about that?
Well, we do know that there has since been a new statement put out by the director of the Centers for Disease Control, Dr. Robert Redfield, where he now advises that testing may be considered for all close contacts of confirmed or probable COVID-19 patients, and that differs from what we heard earlier this week, where it was suggested that if someone had been in contact with someone who had been infected with COVID-19 for a period of about 15 minutes and did not show any signs of symptoms, well, then that person didn't necessarily need to be tested, which a lot of public health experts questioned and balked at. Now, the White House has tried to explain that this was a whole of task force approach by the coronavirus task force, and really suggesting today that some of this has to, in terms of some of the change in guidance, that some of this had to do with a backlog in testing.
Well, Meredith, White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi spoke today by phone about resuming talks for another coronavirus stimulus package. Is there any movement on those negotiations?
No, that's the simple answer, no. We haven't seen any real progress here. And although they did speak on the phone today, there wasn't any movement. And right now, it seems that we really won't see any action until potentially mid-September, when both chambers come back from recess. And there's still $1 trillion gulf between the White House and the Democrats. That's a big bridge that they're going to have to cross, and there's going to be even more pressure on them if they keep putting it off until September, because they're also going to have to negotiate a deal to keep the government open as well, and that's all going to happen, of course, just months before the election, and it's going to be a real test of negotiating skills between the White House and Democrats to pull it off with so much on the line at that moment.
Right, so many Americans really looking for some kind of help from Washington right now. Caitlin, let me ask you, the speakers that we heard from last night in particular really tried to kind of portray a different side of the president than what we're used to seeing with his public persona. Here's the vice president speaking to that. Let's listen.
Over the past 4 years, I've had the privilege to work closely with our president. I've seen him when the cameras are off. Americans see President Trump in lots of different ways. But there's no doubt how President Trump sees America. He sees America for what it is. A nation that has done more good in this world than any other. A nation that deserves far more gratitude than grievance. And if you want a president who falls silent when our heritage is demeaned or insulted, he's not your man.
Caitlin, are there some echoes there of 2016 when some people said the president would grow into the office?
Certainly, and the difference is that the president has been in office for the past 4 years. So Americans have been able to see this firsthand because the president is a wide open book. He tweets everything he says everything that he means, and says what's on his mind. You heard Pence acknowledged that last night, and you also heard Melania Trump earlier this week kind of acknowledge that. So the idea that the president is someone else behind the scenes, he has kind of shown himself to be a very public in his feelings, tweeting and expressing his thoughts very, very regularly. Pence's role in this administration and during the campaign in 2016, and you're seeing this again in 2020, is to be this kind of translator to conservatives, this translator of Trump. And we saw that on display during the times where he was tasked with speaking to governors across the country about coronavirus and the response. He was seen as kind of the conduit to those leaders. And we saw him last night in that same kind of role, trying to speak to conservative Republicans or Republicans who may have been turned off by Trump's rhetoric and may be looking at sitting out this election or maybe even considering Biden. He was trying to urge them to come home to the Republican Party last night, speaking the way that he did and about the successes that he believes the administration has had when it comes to conservative judges and the like.
Right. It is a very different climate, though, in 2020, where, as you say, the president has been very direct, wide open about how he feels, how he thinks, how he views various issues. All right, Nicole Killion, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Meredith McGraw, thank you all very much.